All right, let's talk about the smartphone. We all have one, right? It's probably the first thing you look at in the morning and definitely the last thing you see at night. But what if it isn't what it seems? Today, we're diving into a really provocative document called the Scientific Indictment, and it makes a pretty startling case against that little device in your pocket. So let's just start right there with that question. Think about it. We take them everywhere. We depend on them for pretty much everything. But what if that constant companion isn't just a neutral tool? What if the device in your pocket actually has its own agenda? This right here, this is the central thesis from our source material. I mean, it's an absolutely explosive claim. And to really get what they're saying, we have to understand some of the very specific and, let's be honest, very strange terms that this indictment uses. So let's break them down. So the source frames its entire argument as an occult indictment. The basic idea is that the phone's real purpose is hidden right out in the open, and it's all rooted in concepts that sound way more like ancient mysticism than modern technology. So before we get to the science, let's get a handle on the terms of this indictment. First up, the black mirror. Historically, this was a real thing, a tool used for scrying. Think of a piece of polished black obsidian that people like the 16th century occultist Dr. John Dee used to, allegedly, communicate with beings from other dimensions. The source argues that when your phone is turned off, that screen is a literal, functional black mirror now conveniently in the hands of billions of people. Second, there's this word the source uses all the time, Loosh. It's defined as this quantifiable emotional energy that all of us conscious beings produce. And they're not talking about it like a metaphor. It's presented as a tangible, metaphysical resource, almost like a kind of food that can be harvested. And finally, who is doing all this harvesting? Well, the indictment brings up the ancient Gnostic term Archons. It describes them as these parasitic, non-human intelligences that supposedly manage our reality like a giant farm, with the specific goal of cultivating and collecting our emotional energy, our Loosh. Okay, so with those wild definitions in place, the indictment brings its first formal charge. All right, let's get into it. Charge number 1 argues that the smartphone is, from the ground up, a perfectly engineered addiction engine. The source claims that the basic way we use our apps, the infinite scroll, the pull to refresh, is not an accident. It is a direct application of B.F. Skinner's variable ratio reward schedule. And that is the exact same psychological trick that makes casino slot machines so unbelievably addictive. You do an action like swiping your screen for a totally unpredictable reward. A new post, a like, a notification. That unpredictability just floods your brain with dopamine and creates this powerful compulsive loop. According to the indictment, this isn't about user engagement, it's about creating a pure biological addiction to the device. And here's the indictment's conclusion on that point, and it does not pull any punches. It argues this whole mechanism strips away our conscious choice, basically reducing us to a state of just instinctual reaction, endlessly tapping and swiping for that next little hit of dopamine. Now, building on that idea of addiction, the second charge takes us into what you could almost call cognitive warfare. And the main target? Our ability to simply focus. So this is where it gets really interesting, connecting the kind of content we consume to a much deeper purpose. The indictment argues that the rise of this relentless 15-second high-stimulus content, TikToks, Reels, is an intentional strategy. It's physically rewiring our neural pathways, training our brains to reject any information that isn't delivered in these short, intense bursts. The source actually calls this the war on contemplation, arguing that deep thought, quiet reflection, any kind of real spiritual insight all requires sustained focus, the very thing the system is making biologically impossible for us to do. Yeah, the source doesn't mince words here. This isn't presented as some unfortunate side effect of modern life. It's framed as a direct and systematic assault on a core human ability. And this brings us to the third and final charge. This one deals with the long-term consequences of all this engineered overstimulation, what the indictment calls the dopamine burnout. Okay, so here, the source actually points to clinical research from addiction specialists like Dr. Anna Lemke, and the science is pretty straightforward. When your brain is constantly flooded with these unnaturally high levels of dopamine, it tries to protect itself. It starts to downregulate or reduce the number of its own dopamine receptors. So when you finally put the phone down, you're left in a dopamine deficit state. This leads to something called Anhedonia, literally the inability to feel pleasure, as well as chronic anxiety.
And according to the indictment, this isn't a bug. It's the main feature. It's the ultimate goal, the most efficient harvest. And this slide really illustrates the kind of emotional economy that's allegedly at play. The source breaks down this Loosh energy into two types. Guardian Loosh is that high-frequency stuff, joy, love, gratitude. But a brain with burned-out dopamine receptors literally can't produce that. It defaults to the low-frequency slurry the source calls Archonic Loosh, that constant low-grade hum of anxiety, apathy, and Anhedonia. The device, it claims, drains you of the good stuff and replaces it with this perpetual state of feeling bad. So after laying out these three big charges, the addiction, the fractured attention, and the dopamine burnout, the indictment delivers its final verdict on what it sees as the smartphone's ultimate purpose. And this is that final verdict. The source calls it a voluntary quarantine. It's a prison with no walls and no guards because we police ourselves. Our consciousness gets captured. Our heads are bowed in submission to the black mirror. According to the indictment, the device is an electronic tether, ensuring, in its really chilling words, that the livestock never strays too far from the feeding trough. So, that's the case laid out in the scientific indictment. It is a challenging and deeply unconventional perspective, for sure. It reframes this everyday object as something far more complex and, according to the source, far more sinister. So we'll leave you with this. You've heard the indictment against the prison cell in your pocket. The only question left is, who is the jailer?